We mark the start of this case at 7:30 on a cool October morning in a valley on the east side of the Sawyers Ridge Range, central Idaho. Frost sat low in the grass around the trailhead, thin white on the tire ruts, melting where the sun already reached the gravel. At that hour, a gray pickup pulled into the small lot at the end of Forest Road 19. The truck belonged to a man named Daniel Cobb, 42 years old, school custodian, part-time hunting guide, local resident. He signed the day use register out of habit. In the comments line, he wrote a short note: "Scouting ridge for late-season elk, back by dark. We know that much from the sheet in the metal box by the gate, and from a photo taken by another group of hunters who arrived just after him. In the picture, his truck is already parked on the far side. Nothing looks out of place." Cobb did not come back that night. According to his wife, he had a fixed pattern in the fall. Day trips only. One rifle, light pack, no overnight kit unless he told her in advance. He kept a weather radio in the kitchen and checked it every morning before work. He knew that country. His father had run pack strings up Sawyers Ridge in the 70s. On that day, the conditions were not severe. High cloud, no wind to speak of, night temperature forecast just above freezing. Roads dry. The sort of day people here describe as easy. The first concern came at 9:40 that night, when his wife called the county dispatch. The dispatcher logged her statement verbatim: "Husband overdue from day scout, left at about 6, should have checked in by 7, not answering cell, truck not home." By 10:15, a sheriff deputy and one Forest Service law enforcement officer were at the road end. They found the gray truck in the same place it appears in the photo from that morning. Doors locked, no broken glass, no keys in sight. One detail stood out in the initial vehicle check. On the passenger seat lay a folded topographic map of Unit 14, the hunting unit that covers Sawyers Ridge and the valley around it. The map was dry, unwrinkled, with 3 faint pencil circles on the ridgeline. The rifle case was empty and slid behind the seat. A half-full thermos sat in the cup holder, still faintly warm when they touched it. The back of the truck held the standard contents for a local hunter: chains, a plastic tote with rope, tarp, and an old cooler. Nothing suggested a second person. No extra pack, no extra rifle. At 11:30, the deputy cleared with dispatch to place a call-out to the county search and rescue team. The first page went out on the volunteer radios around midnight. "We have the log. 14 members responded that night, more the next morning." The initial assumption was simple. An experienced hunter had injured a leg or gotten turned around in the timber and was sitting somewhere near a game trail waiting for daylight. It happens every year. By 2 in the morning, they had a hasty team on the main trail with headlamps and handheld radios. They walked in and waited for radio traffic from the command post at the road. Morning air sat heavy in the bottom of the valley, cold enough that their breath hung in front of them. Above the cottonwoods, the ridgeline was just starting to show. At 6:30, the search leader, a retired fire captain named Harlan Pierce, came on the air. His voice is clear in the recording. He assigned 2 more hasty teams to push past the 1-mile mark, one on each side of the creek, with instructions to stay within sight of water and call out every few minutes. A third team was told to sweep the lower creek crossings for tracks. They moved in textbook fashion. Slow pace, frequent stops to listen. Radios checked on a set schedule. By mid-morning, they had covered close to 3 miles of trail and bank in a narrow corridor, from the parking area to the first bend in the valley. They found nothing. No fresh boot prints distinct from other traffic. No broken brush. No dropped glove or cartridge. The ground was still damp in shaded spots from melt and night frost, soft enough that a full-grown man carrying a pack should have left a clear pattern. Back at the vehicles, a second element was forming. County deputies set up a small command tent by the gate. Coffee on a camp stove. A large paper map pinned to a sheet of plywood leaned against a tailgate. They marked the last known point at the truck and the probable route along the main trail. They also drew 3 circles on the ridgeline, that roughly matched the pencil marks on his personal map. At 9:15, a dog team arrived from the neighboring county. The handler took a scent article from the truck seat cover and from the inside band of a ball cap on the dash. The dog, a German shepherd, showed interest and pulled toward the gate as soon as the handler gave the command. Everyone expected the dog to lead up the main trail. Instead, the animal veered right within the first 100 yards and followed an old logging spur that paralleled the valley, staying on the low bench above the creek. The spur was rutted and partly grown in, but still walkable. The handler called back on the radio, reporting a strong pull and consistent behavior. That detail is important. It is the first thing in this file that does not match the simple picture of a lost hunter. His usual approach for elk was straight up the valley on the main line. His friends confirmed that later. There was no reason for him to take the spur unless he wanted to move quiet above the creek. Even then, he had never mentioned using it. The dog followed the old road for about half a mile, nose down, tail high, then cut off into open timber on the uphill side. For another 10 minutes, the track was steady, weaving between fir trunks, crossing patches of grass and needle duff. Then the dog stopped. The handler marked the spot with flagging tape, tried a restart, and circled the area in widening loops. On the radio, he described the change. The dog showed confusion, checked the same tree roots and rocks, then sat down and looked back at him. No clear direction out. They tried bringing the dog back to the truck and starting again. The second track pulled in the same direction, along the same spur, into the same timber, and ended in roughly the same patch of woods, with the same behavior. No obvious contamination from other people. No wind shift strong enough to explain it. On the map, that stopping point sits on the lower shoulder of the ridge, about 3/4 of a mile from the truck. When I walked it years later, the ground there still looked ordinary. Mixed fir and pine, modest slope, no cliffs, no hidden sinkholes, no old mine cuts, nothing that would swallow a man in one step. By noon of that first full day, the working assumption quietly shifted. The logbook phrasing changes from overdue hunter to missing subject. The search expanded in the afternoon. Fresh teams arrived from the north end of the county, along with 2 more deputies and a volunteer medic. They divided the map into sectors and taped them to the hood of a patrol truck. Pierce drew 3 new boundaries in red pencil, each higher on the ridge than the last, and assigned crews to begin systematic sweeps. Weather held steady. High thin cloud. Light wind moving down valley. Good visibility in the timber. Underfoot, the surface stayed soft enough to take impressions. That mattered to the trackers. They depended on ground sign to separate older traffic from anything recent. At 1:30, a 2-person crew working Sector B called in a possible print on a patch of exposed soil near a deadfall. The note in the log is cautious. Partial heel. No tread detail. Could be subject. Could be old. They flagged it and widened their search. No follow-up prints were found. The dog team made a 3rd attempt near the morning termination point. Results were the same. Strong initial track, firm pull, sudden loss of direction in a small area with nothing unusual on the ground. The handler requested a 2nd dog, but the nearest available team was hours away. The search leader made the call to push forward with ground crews. Deputies hiked up to the lower saddle on the ridge to check a glassing spot the subject sometimes used. They found a stone ledge with a good view of the basin. No sign he had been there. No brass. No marks in the dirt. No food wrappers. No prints in the soft ash layer that collects near those rocks. Negative finding. Noted at 1540. Farther east, a team swept a shallow drainage that feeds into the main creek. They moved slowly, checking all downed logs and low cover. The drainage carried only a trickle of water. Mud along the edges showed tracks from deer and a single black bear, but no human prints. By late afternoon, a helicopter from the State Aviation Unit arrived on scene. The pilot made 2 slow passes over the lower ridge, then flew the full length of the valley, scanning for color contrast. The observer in the back seat reported no visible gear, no orange, no reflective material, no movement. Crews on the ground paused to listen for the aircraft, in case rotor wash disturbed anything, but found nothing new. At 1700 hours, the command post took a call from the subject's brother. He had packed and was driving in from the county line. Pierce logged the conversation. Brother confirmed the subject's usual habits, confirmed no medical issues, and confirmed the subject never camped without telling someone. He also mentioned one specific detail that shaped the next day's plan. The subject preferred to walk ridgetops in the evening if he was scouting elk sign. He liked high ground and long views. That note prompted Pierce to extend the search boundary upslope. He briefed teams to prepare for a full ridge sweep the next morning, running north to south along Sawyer's Ridge and back down the opposite side. At dusk, the light faded quickly in the timber. Crews checked in by radio as they withdrew to the trailhead. Each gave a brief negative report. No contact, no sound, no visual, no new sign. By 1930, the last team reached the trucks. They logged out, rehydrated, and stood by for assignments. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in the first hour of darkness. Frost began to settle again on open patches of ground. It would preserve tracks until morning, but it also meant trouble for anyone exposed overnight. The final entry for that day in the operations log is a short note from Pierce. Subject not located. No confirmed clues. Dog track inconsistent. Ridge sweep planned at first light. Hold hope, but prepare extended search. It is the kind of line you see often in these cases, written by someone who has spent years reading terrain and weather and knows when a file is drifting out of the routine. First light on the second full day brought a thin layer of frost across the valley floor and a heavier sheet of it on the ridge line. The air was still. No wind in the treetops. Radios checked clear on the command channel. Pierce briefed the teams beside the trucks, using the hood of a deputy's vehicle as a map table. The plan was simple. 2 crews would climb to the crest of Sawyer's Ridge from the west side and walk the spine north to south. 2 more would ascend from the east side using an older fire trail, then sweep back down into the main valley. A 5th team remained in reserve near the command post to respond to any call-out. The dog team was held back to rest. The climb to the ridge took about 40 minutes. Frost held firm in shaded pockets. In open areas, it had already begun to melt. From the crest, the view ran for miles. Low mist sat in the bottom of the next basin. Beyond that, the far peaks showed early light on their upper slopes. The ridge crew started north. They walked in a straight line, spacing about 30 feet apart. Each member scanned both sides of the ridge edge, checking for depressions, fresh breaks in brush, or anything that showed movement off the crest. They announced their progress on the radio every half mile. At 8:12, the southern team made a brief report. They had located an old campfire ring near a rocky knob. Ash cold. No recent use. They photographed it, recorded coordinates, and continued. No prints around it. At 8:51, the northern crew called in a possible clue. They had found a broken fir sapling, waist height, bent sharply down slope. The wood inside the break looked dry. They judged it older than a day. They flagged it and moved on. Nothing below it suggested a fall line. By mid-morning, both ridge teams reported negative findings for the entire upper crest. No boot tracks, no dropped items, no indication that the missing man had reached high ground at any point after leaving his truck. Pierce met with the team leaders at the command post around 10. They reviewed the map. With the ridge ruled out for fresh sign, the focus shifted to the middle elevations. A new plan formed. Teams would contour across the slope between 3,000 and 4,000 feet, searching parallel to the valley. While that meeting took place, a deputy walked back to the truck to retrieve the subject's map for a second look. When he unfolded it, he noticed something the earlier crew had not emphasized. The pencil circles on the ridge were faint, but a lighter mark sat lower on the slope, almost erased. A small half-circle near a miner saddle. It was unclear whether the subject had made it, or whether it was an old annotation. Pierce decided to send a team there. At 11:20, a two-person crew hiked toward that saddle. The terrain was open, dry grass, scattered fur, patches of bare soil. If the subject had crossed there the day before, some trace should still be visible. The crew moved slowly, zigzagging every 20 yards. They reached the saddle at noon. No prints, no brush disturbance, no cartridge brass, no fabric. They made a slow sweep of the area and reported a full negative. Meanwhile, the trackers in Sector D found something that looked promising at first. A scuff mark on a sloped section of duff, followed by a slight depression in soft ground. But the scuff lacked tread. The depression lacked heel shape. It could have been made by an elk hoof dragging uphill. They photographed it, marked it, and wrote uncertain origin in the log. By 1400 hours, the search had covered nearly every obvious travel line between the ridge and the valley floor. Still no confirmed sign. Only the dog's morning track suggested a direction, and that track ended without explanation. In late afternoon, the reserve team walked the lower spur again. They wanted to recheck the point where the dog had stalled the day before. When they reached it, one of the searchers knelt beside an exposed patch of soil, brushed away a thin layer of frost, and paused. He called his partner over. In the middle of the patch sat a single oval mark. Shallow, no tread detail, roughly the size of a heel. Around it the ground was undisturbed. No toe, no continuation, just one partial shape in a place they had already walked. They photographed it and called it in. The logbook records Pierce's reply. He asked whether it looked fresh. The searcher answered that it looked newer than anything else nearby, but too incomplete for a firm statement. It was logged as possible clue, unconfirmed. With light fading, all teams withdrew to the trailhead. Second day ended like the first. No subject, no clear sign, no direction to push next. On the morning of the third full day, the operation shifted from focused search to broad area clearance. The command post expanded. 2 more canopies were erected beside the trucks. A whiteboard replaced the paper map. Pierce wrote 3 headings across the top. Known sign, unconfirmed sign, negative areas. Under the first heading, there was still nothing. Temperatures held low. Frost thickened on the benches above the creek. The helicopter made an early pass, flying tight circles over the timber where the dog had stopped on the first day. The observer reported no disturbance to the canopy, no visible gear, no thermal anomalies. The aircraft moved to the ridge, then to the drainage east of the ridge, then returned to the valley. Again, negative. Ground crews formed into 4-person units. Each unit was assigned a grid block beginning at the lower foothills. The instruction was simple. Clear each block with slow straight-line sweeps, mark it with tape, and move to the next. If they found even a small shred of cloth, they were to call it in. At 8:23, the first team entered Grid 3A, a rectangle of mixed fir and open grass about 800 yards above the creek. They advanced on a compass line, keeping visual contact in the trees. At 80 yards in, one of the volunteers halted. He pointed to a low branch on a young pine. Caught in the needles was a thin hair of unknown origin. Too dark to be elk, too coarse for domestic dog. They photographed it, placed it in a paper envelope, and flagged the tree. Later analysis would classify it as inconclusive. No root, no viable sample. The team marked the area as cleared and moved on. In 4C, another team found a pile of old bear scat and a section of disturbed moss that looked like the edge of an animal bed. No prints, no human-related debris. Logged and cleared. Pierce maintained a fixed rhythm on the radio. Every 20 minutes he checked in on each team. Every hour he re-evaluated the map. They had expected to pick up some form of directional hint by now. A dropped glove, a cartridge, a water bottle, even a torn piece of cloth. The absence of anything raised concern in a quiet way. No one said it over the air, but the pattern was familiar to anyone who had worked these forests long enough. At 10:30, the trackers in Sector G identified something that warranted a closer look. A line of 3 depressions on a gentle slope, spaced roughly the length of a human stride. Each depression shallow. No tread. No heel edge. The spacing was too even to dismiss. The trackers knelt, studied the soil, tested firmness with their palms. One wrote in his notebook, "Possible travel line, low confidence." They followed it upslope but lost it in a patch of needlefall. They flagged the spot and reported their findings. It became another entry under unconfirmed sign. At 11:50, a deputy and 2 volunteers searched a cluster of boulders at the edge of a small draw. They checked all gaps wide enough for a person, shined lights into crevices, and scanned the ground for drag marks. The draw carried no water. The soil was dry, no sign of occupancy. Negative finding. Shortly after noon, a cold wind came down the ridge. It shifted dry needles across open ground and began to erase the shallowest impressions. The trackers worked faster, knowing the surface conditions were changing. The window for reading ground sign was narrowing. In mid-afternoon, the search leader called a brief stand-down at the trailhead. Teams gathered for water and a 10-minute rest. Pierce stood by the whiteboard, studying the spread of cleared grids. He circled the only cluster of ambiguous clues, the area around the dog's loss of track. It remained the center of the map despite 2 days of effort. Everything pointed toward it, yet nothing came out of it. After the break, 2 teams were sent to rework that area with a slower pattern. They moved inward from opposite sides, calling the subject's name at intervals, pausing to listen. No response, no scent indication, no visual sign, only quiet air between the trees. At 1700 hours, the Western crew radioed in. They had inspected every fallen log and checked every depression large enough to hold a person. No trace, no disturbance. They classified the area as cleared, even though no one felt fully satisfied, marking it that way. Near sunset, the last team walked back to the trucks. They logged out and set their radios to charge. The frost began forming again in the open spaces. The temperature dropped faster than the night before. The final note from Pierce reads the same way many such notes read in complex searches. Ground nearly saturated. No clear sign. Reassess strategy in morning. Hold all options open. Day 4 began with a formal briefing under dim headlights. The sky was overcast. No frost on the lower ground, but a thin crust remained higher on the ridge. Pierce spoke in the same calm tone he had used all week. He pointed at the cluster of unresolved clues around the dog track and told the crews they would concentrate there until every line of travel had been accounted for. They divided into 3 groups. One group would walk contour lines above the termination point. One would grid the slope below it. The third would recheck the old logging spur from end to end, including the brushy sections that earlier teams had skirted. The first group climbed into the trees at 7:30. The air was still. The forest floor damp but not saturated. Visibility good. They moved slowly, pausing every 10 steps to scan. One of the volunteers carried a notebook and recorded each minor observation. Squirrel tracks, elk pellets, windfall branches. Everything had to be noted, so it would not be mistaken later. The second group, working the lower slope, found a small rise covered with pine duff. They searched around its base and inspected a dry gully that fed into the creek. The gully held no water and showed no prints, only a single raccoon track at the edge of a puddle from the previous night's melt. They marked it and continued. At 8:40, the spur team reported that they had reached the point where the dog had veered off on the first day. They described it as an unremarkable bend in the old road. Grass cover light, soil compact, no obvious prints. They moved 10 yards at a time, checking both sides. At the second bend, one volunteer found a small indentation in the moss. No shape, no edge, possibly animal, logged and flagged. As the morning progressed, Pierce requested a second canine team from a neighboring state. That handler had experience with older tracks. The arrival time was estimated at mid-afternoon. Until then, the crews continued working every feature around the original scent loss. In late morning, the contour crew called in a possible anomaly. They had found a piece of bark, wedged in an unusual position against a rock. It looked out of place. They examined it and found no associated sign, no prints leading to it, no scuff below it. Probably wind. They photographed it but did not treat it as a clue. The note in the log reads, "Natural placement, presumed." Shortly after 10, one of the volunteers on the lower slope crew stopped to listen. He thought he heard a faint metallic sound. The others paused with him. They waited almost a full minute. Nothing followed. No echo. No repeat. They logged it as unconfirmed sound, direction unknown. By midday, all three groups had completed a full sweep of the area immediately surrounding the termination point. Each team reported negative findings, no track continuation, no itemized evidence, no scent indication. On the ground, it remained a clean patch of forest with no sign that a man had passed through. The second canine team arrived at 2:30. The handler took time to let the dog acclimate. Then he collected scent from the cap in the truck, the same article used on day 1. The dog moved toward the trailhead, then paused, turned, and walked toward the logging spur. Same direction, same initial pull. When the handler reached the bend where the first dog had veered off, the new dog slowed, circled, and pressed its nose to the ground. For a moment it looked promising. The dog seemed to find direction. It walked into the timber at a steady pace, tail moving, body forward. The handler followed. They moved for about 2 minutes. Then the dog stopped abruptly. It turned in a half circle, checked the same tree trunk twice, then sat down. The handler tried a restart. Same pattern. Strong start. Sudden stop. No exit line. He reported the behavior exactly as observed. The presence of a second dog confirming the same stall point was significant. It meant the initial direction was genuine, yet whatever scent existed beyond that point evaporated or fell irregularly. Crews spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting a tight spiral search around the stall area. They spaced 10 feet apart and walked expanding circles. No fabric, no spent round, no scrape mark on a tree, no depression in the soil. Nothing. At 1740, with light thinning in the timber, Pierce asked for final reports. Each team listed their grid sections, their negative findings, and any minor observations. The whiteboard under known sign remained empty. The last entry of the day stated simply, "No progress. All probable lines cleared. Central anomaly unresolved." Day 5 started under low cloud. A light mist moved through the valley. Visibility stayed workable in the timber, but reduced on the ridge. The command post opened at 6. Lanterns hung from the canopy frame. Radios checked clear. Batteries swapped. Pierce spoke briefly with the deputies before gathering the teams for the morning briefing. He reviewed the whiteboard. Known sign remained blank. Unconfirmed sign listed the partial heel, the 3 shallow depressions, the hair sample, and the ambiguous scuff marks. Nothing formed a coherent line. He told the crews they would widen the search perimeter in all directions. The pattern would shift from focused grids to broader sweeps, using extended spacing where terrain allowed. At 7, a 4-person team moved east toward the secondary drainage. They followed a game trail for 200 yards, then swung north in a slow arc. They passed through patches of waist-high brush, checked downed logs, and watched the soil for impressions. The brush held droplets from the mist. Any recent human passage should have left a swath. They found none. Another crew moved up the western slope. They advanced in a straight line, spacing nearly 40 feet apart. One volunteer walked with a GPS to ensure they held direction. They crossed a series of small benches, each covered with pine duff. The duff was undisturbed except for animal tracks. Deer, small mammals. No human pattern. At 8:40, the helicopter returned. The observer leaned out on a short tether, scanning the slopes around the search focus. He called down to the command post. No movement, no color contrast, no heat signatures. The pilot made a second pass, following the spur road and then circling the dog track area. Negative again. Near 9:15, the eastern team reached a narrow meadow with wet ground at the edges. They slowed and looked for prints. The mud near a shallow pool showed one large elk print and several smaller animal tracks. No human sign. The team photographed the area and radioed a negative finding. At the same time, the western team located a patch of disturbed leaves at the base of a fir. They examined it closely. The disturbance lacked direction. No outline of footwear. Probably animal bedding or wind. They flagged it and moved on. The note in the log records, probable natural cause. By mid-morning, the perimeter of cleared ground had expanded significantly. Pierce gathered the sector leaders at the command post to reassess. The map now showed several days of effort with no progression. He suggested checking the far end of the old logging spur. It ended at a small turnaround above the creek. The assumption was that previous crews had already covered it, but he wanted a fresh look. A two-person team reached the spur end shortly after 11. The turnaround held old tire ruts, hardened and mossed over. They checked its edges. No boot prints, no fabric, no disturbance. A line of old fence wire lay half buried in the soil. They lifted it carefully. Nothing beneath. Negative finding logged at 11:20. Shortly before noon, a volunteer on the southern sweep radioed in a faint odor near a stand of older pines. Not strong, not identifiable. He described it as earthy, maybe animal. The team paused and assessed the area. No carcass, no sign of feeding, no disturbed soil. The odor faded quickly, logged as unconfirmed smell. After the midday break, Pierce deployed a team to walk the creek corridor. They moved slowly along the water, checking alcoves, root tangles, and undercut banks. The creek ran shallow. Clear flow. Rocks visible at the bottom. No clothing caught on branches. No sign of anyone entering or crossing. The banks held the same mix of deer and raccoon tracks seen earlier. Nothing else. At 14:30, a deputy and two volunteers climbed toward a rocky outcrop above the central search zone. It offered a vantage point over the valley. Some hunters used it for glassing. They found the ledge empty, dust on the rock undisturbed. No sign that the missing man had been there. Negative. Near 1600 hours, the teams began tightening their sweep, moving back toward the original anomaly point. The second K9 team made one more attempt before dusk. The dog behaved the same as before. Initial interest, pull, sudden loss of direction, no continuation, no alert. By 17:30, all crews withdrew. Mist settled lower in the valley. Temperature dropped. Radios were placed on charge. The whiteboard remained unchanged. The central point held its place as the only area with repeated but inconclusive indicators. The final note of the day reads, "Wide perimeter cleared. No subject. No verified sign. Focus remains unresolved center." Day 6 opened with a light fog across the valley floor. It moved slowly between the cottonwoods and drifted in low bands along the lower benches. Visibility in the trees was 50 to 70 yards. Radios checked functional, batteries full. Pierce stood by the hood of a patrol truck and spoke to the crews in the same even tone. His instructions were simple. Revisit every overlooked corner inside the primary zone. Check depressions, deadfall pockets, and minor drainages. No assumptions. At 7:20, the first team returned to the shallow gully southwest of the dog track area. They had searched it on day 3, but now worked it inch by inch. One volunteer moved ahead with a probe to test soft pockets. The others checked root tangles. The gully held damp soil from overnight fog. No boot marks, no drag lines, no debris. Negative finding. A second team climbed toward the low saddle that had been examined on day 2. They moved slower this time, stopping every few yards to scan both up and down slope. They found one new disturbance. A patch of duff shifted away from the base of a small stump. The soil beneath showed no heel or toe, no defined edge. Could have been an animal. Could have been a searcher from earlier days. Logged as unconfirmed. At 8:45, a volunteer on the northern sweep called a halt. Something had caught on a branch at shoulder height. A small thread, light in color. The team inspected it. Synthetic fiber. No pattern. No weave. It could have come from a backpack strap. It could have been from older debris. They placed it in a paper tube and flagged the branch. The log notes its size. Less than 1 centimeter. No match to known clothing yet. Unconfirmed clue. Near 9:30, the fog lifted enough for the helicopter to make a short run. The aircraft flew low along the ridge, then dropped into the valley and passed directly over the dog termination point. The observer leaned out and scanned the ground. No visible change. No heat. No movement. They widened the circle. Negative once again. At 10, the creek corridor team returned to an undercut bank where they had seen raccoon tracks on day 4. Water level unchanged. Sand undisturbed. No new impressions. No sign of anyone entering the creek. They cleared the section and moved downstream. Across the slope, the western team revisited a cluster of downed logs. They lifted bark, checked hollows, and looked under each trunk. A faint discoloration on one log caught attention. They scraped it lightly. Pollen streak. Natural. They replaced the bark and marked the spot to avoid repeat checking. Logged as negative. Shortly after 11, the southern team reported a possible sit point. A shallow depression in the pine needles beside a rock, roughly the size of a seated person. No defined edges. No prints leading in or out. The depression could have formed from weather or an animal resting. They documented it with photos and flagged the perimeter. The log notes, no conclusion. During the midday review, Pierce studied the whiteboard again. The central cluster remained the same. The partial heel, the shallow depressions, the fiber, the dog stalls, all within a narrow radius, none strong enough to direct movement outward. He sent 2 teams to begin a slow outward spiral from that center, spacing 15 feet apart. The spiral teams moved methodically. One volunteer marked their path with small pieces of flagging to ensure no overlap. They found broken branches consistent with windfall. They found animal beds. They found nothing that pointed toward the missing man. At 14:10, the eastern spiral team paused near a large fir. A faint scent caught one volunteer's attention. Hard to place, not strong. The others checked the air. They noted it. The scent dissipated in less than a minute. No trace on the ground. Logged as unconfirmed odor. Low significance. By mid-afternoon, the fog had cleared, but the light stayed flat under cloud cover. Trackers walked each contour line near the central zone with renewed focus. They tested soil firmness, checked small rises, and followed faint animal trails to their ends. No track. No human-related sign. Near 1600 hours, Pierce called in all teams for a brief regroup. They spread the map across the tailgate and reviewed every spot where a clue had been logged. Each was re-examined in discussion. None stood out. None provided direction. Pierce told the crews to finish the day with a final sweep of the nearest timber edge. The timber edge sweep found only windfall debris and old elk tracks. No scent, no print, no fabric. When the last team walked out at 18:20, mist was forming again in the low ground. Temperature dropping. The operations log for day 6 closes with a quiet line. Central zone fully rechecked. No confirmed evidence. No movement outward. Situation unchanged. Day 7 began with a colder air mass settled in the valley. The ground held a thin crust where frost had built overnight. Radios transmitted clear. The crews gathered near the command canopy. Pierce spoke with the same steady cadence. He told them they would expand the search in measured legs outward from the central zone, working farther than previous days, but maintaining overlap checks near any unconfirmed sign. At 7:10, the first team moved west toward a series of shallow benches. They walked slow lines, eyes on the ground. Each bench held the same mix of pine needles and scattered stone. The volunteers checked each fallen log, probing hollows with a hiking pole. No sign, no debris, no recent prints. A second team advanced east toward a larger drainage. They followed the high side of the slope, stepping over roots and checking for any break in duff that might show travel. They reached a small rise. The soil was thin and patchy. A slight depression caught their attention. No heel line, no toe line. Possibly wildlife. Logged and flagged. At 8:30, the northern group arrived near the edge of an old burn scar. The area was open, covered with low regrowth. Visibility extended nearly 200 yards. If the subject had crossed the scar at any point, they expected to see his passage through the lighter cover. They found only animal trails weaving across the open ground. No human lines. Negative finding. Around 9, the helicopter made another slow circuit. The observer scanned the drainage east of the primary search zone. The radio report came back the same as previous days. No color contrast. No gear. No reflective signature. The aircraft banked once more over the center and returned to base. At 9:42, the eastern team located a cluster of small stones arranged in an irregular pattern, 2 feet across. They considered the possibility of a natural slide. The stones had dust beneath them, undisturbed. No human handling evident. Logged as natural formation. The western team, working higher up the slope, reported a narrow seam of loose soil along a game trail. It angled downslope. One volunteer knelt to inspect. The soil showed no tread, no pattern. They followed it for 30 yards until it joined a larger elk trail. Negative. During the mid-morning break, the crews returned to the command post. Pierce studied the whiteboard again. The marks from earlier days formed a tight cluster. All efforts to move outward had produced clean ground. He asked the trackers to focus on small anomalies. Anything that looked out of place needed to be examined twice. After the break, a 2-person team followed a faint deer trail north of the anomaly point. They moved slowly, reading each patch of soil. In one spot, they found a line of compressed needles, about a foot long. No defined shape. Too irregular for a boot. Could have been an animal step. They logged it and flagged the trail junction. At 12:30, the creek corridor team revisited the upper reaches of the waterway. The rocks were damp from melt, the bank soil soft in places. They checked under roots and along the waterline. No fabric caught on any branch, no impressions on the bank. The corridor was logged clear for the 3rd time. Shortly after 1300 hours, a volunteer on the southern line paused. He thought he saw a slight change in soil color where a boot might have pressed and then released. They examined it with care. The soil was too coarse to show detail. No matching impression nearby. Logged as unconfirmed disturbance, low relevance. The afternoon progressed with steady but unproductive work. Teams moved farther from the center, covering new ground at controlled pace. They found animal tracks. They found natural depressions. They found nothing that matched the missing man's possible movement. At 15:40, a deputy and 2 volunteers reached a rocky outcrop half a mile east of the central point. They searched the cracks and the perimeter. No sign of a fall. No personal items. Dust on the rock surface was even. Negative. Around 16:30, the light began to flatten. The clouds thickened. Pierce asked each team to return through the central zone on their way back. They did so, examining all previously flagged spots. The partial heel depression looked unchanged. The shallow depressions on the slope remained indistinct. The fiber sample marker held where it had been placed. Nothing suggested new disturbance. By 17:15, all crews checked in at the trailhead. Radios set to charge, equipment accounted for. The map board updated with new clear areas. The central cluster remained the only region showing any form of uncertain evidence, and none of it qualified as a verified sign. The final note for Day 7 reads, "Wider perimeter clear. No confirmed contact. Central anomaly persists without development." Day 8 began with a hard freeze line across the benches above the creek. The ground held firm underfoot. Pine needles were stiff with frost. Light wind moved down slope from the ridge. Visibility remained good. Pierce gathered the crews near the command canopy and reviewed the plan. They would push even farther out, covering distant terrain that a lost or injured subject might have reached if he had moved steadily after leaving the truck. At the same time, two teams would again recheck the central anomaly in slow, overlapping patterns. At 7:15, the first extended team moved northwest toward a series of low ridgelines. They kept a wide spacing, nearly 50 feet at times, adjusting for open timber. The lead tracker studied the ground closely. In several places, the soil was too rocky to hold prints, but the duff between stones would show disturbance if someone had walked through recently. They found none. Only old elk tracks and the faint lines left by deer. A second team headed southeast into denser timber. They followed a contour line until they reached a set of shallow swales. The swales held pockets of frozen soil and patches of leaf litter. The volunteers used sticks to probe the deeper pockets, checking for any sign of a fall or buried item. Nothing surfaced. No fabric. No impact lines. Negative finding. At 8:40, the helicopter completed a short search loop. The observer looked for any sign of color contrast along the extended ridges. He reported nothing unusual. No movement under the canopy. No irregular shapes in the open sections. The aircraft circled once more above the anomaly point, then returned to base. By 9, one of the teams working south reached a natural terrace about half a mile from the central zone. The surface was mixed pine needles and small stones. A volunteer stopped and crouched near a shallow depression. The soil appeared slightly compacted. They examined it with care. No defined shape, no heel, no toe. No second impression. Possibly animal. Logged as unconfirmed. A team in the northeast sector reported a possible fabric catch on a patch of thorn brush. They cut the stem and retrieved the fiber. It was thin, faded, synthetic. Similar in size to the fiber found on day 6, but the color differed slightly. Could have come from older debris. Could have been from any number of hikers who used the area in previous seasons. Logged as low relevance. At 10:20, the central recheck teams began their slow sweep. They spaced 10 feet apart, moving in deliberate lines directly across the known anomaly points. The partial heel depression still showed its faint outline, unchanged in shape and depth. The shallow 3-step pattern noted earlier in the week now looked even more weathered. Ice crystals had formed in the indentation during the night and melted by mid-morning. No new detail appeared. One volunteer noticed a faint indentation under a fir root. The soil held moisture from the freeze. They brushed it lightly. No tread. No direction. Possibly an animal step from days earlier. Logged and flagged. Around 11, the northern extended team reached a small meadow with frost still present on the shaded side. They checked carefully for prints. The frost would have recorded any human passage from early morning. It showed nothing except deer tracks and a single line of small mammal prints crossing the meadow from east to west. Negative. Shortly before noon, a deputy and 2 volunteers on the eastern sweep reached a rocky spine with a clear view into the next drainage. Some hunters used this vantage during elk season. If the missing man had come this far, they expected to find some trace. Shell casing, footprint, scrape mark. They found none. Dust on the rock surface was even. No disturbance. Negative. After the midday pause, Pierce assigned 2 teams to begin a controlled descent into the drainage east of the central zone. This drainage had been scanned by air, but not fully walked. The slope was moderate. Ground cover mixed. They moved slowly, checking each root mass and outcrop. At 13:40, a volunteer noted a faint odor near a cluster of old logs. It dissipated quickly. They checked under the logs. No remains. No fabric. No disturbance. Logged as unconfirmed odor without direction. As afternoon progressed, the extended perimeter continued to return clean. No trail. No items. No confirmed human sign. The creek's corridor was checked again. Water level steady. Banks unchanged. Ground conditions consistent with previous days. At 15:50, The central teams conducted one more overlapping pass through the area where both dogs had stalled. They worked with meticulous care. Each indentation, each downed branch, each small depression, nothing new presented. The area remained open forest with no sign of distress or passage. Near 1645, the temperature began dropping again. Shadows lengthened between the firs. Teams were called back in steady intervals. Radios were checked in. Findings were logged. The whiteboard updated with expanded cleared zones. The central cluster remained unchanged. Still no confirmed evidence that the missing man had traveled beyond it. Still no indication of direction. The final note from Day 8 reads, "Perimeter widened. All new sectors negative. Central anomaly remains only consistent feature. No progression." Day 9 opened under clearer skies. Cold air held steady across the valley and up the ridge. Frost remained on the shaded ground past sunrise. Radios checked clean. The command post had the same quiet rhythm it had carried all week. Pierce gathered the teams beside the tailgate map and explained the plan. They would move into secondary terrain beyond the previous perimeter. At the same time, a smaller detail would recheck the original trailhead area and the immediate surroundings of the truck. Nothing could be assumed closed. At 7:10, the first extended team moved north toward a broad slope of mixed fir and open pockets. They advanced in slow lines, spacing adjusted for terrain. A tracker walked point, eyes on the ground, calling halts whenever he saw any disturbed patch. The first hour passed with only animal sign. Old deer beds, elk tracks, no prints indicating human movement. A second team moved southwest. They climbed over a series of low rock shelves, each shelf separated by narrow strips of duff. The volunteers brushed each strip with their gloves, checking for impressions. No clear depressions, no fabric, no metallic glint from dropped items. Negative. At 8:20, a deputy and 3 volunteers inspected the first quarter mile of the logging spur from the trailhead. The assumption had been that this area was fully covered early in the search, but Pierce wanted it reviewed with new eyes. They checked both sides of the spur, probing between shrubs. They inspected an old culvert. No sign, no debris, no prints. The truck remained the only confirmed location. Around 8:50, the helicopter made another slow pass. The observer focused on distant ridges. He reported no movement and no sign of clothing. The aircraft circled the search center once more. Negative. It then returned to refuel. At 9, one of the southwest teams paused on a small rise. A volunteer crouched by a faint soil disturbance beside a fallen branch. They brushed it lightly. The dirt held no heel shape, no toe. Possibly an animal step softened by freeze and thaw, logged as unconfirmed. By 9:45, the northern extended team reached a patch of ground that held frost longer than surrounding areas. They stepped carefully. If a person had passed through at sunrise, there would be a break in the frost layer. The surface was clean. No melt patterns. No disruption. Only a thin line of rodent tracks crossing diagonally. Negative. Shortly before 10, a team working southeast found a shallow hollow near a boulder. They checked for any trace of occupancy. No leaves disturbed. No cloth. No item tucked into the rock. They stood quietly for a moment, listening. Wind moved lightly through upper branches. Nothing else. Logged as negative. At 10:30, the recheck crew returned to the truck. They examined the exterior again, noting the dust layer, the position of the tires, and the condition of the lock cylinders. All unchanged. They opened the door under deputy supervision. The interior held the same items documented on day 1. Map, thermos, a fleece jacket on the floorboard, the cap used for scent. Nothing new. No note. No sign of return. Negative. Around 11, the extended crew working west reached an area of intertwined deadfall where movement would have been difficult. They worked it methodically, crawled over 2 trunks, looked under each. A faint indentation in duff under one log raised brief interest. They tested it. Too small for a person. Likely raccoon bed. Logged accordingly. After the midday break, Pierce sent 2 crews to scout the narrow drainage north of the anomaly center. It had been viewed at distance, but not walked in detail. The drainage floor held moist soil and scattered leaf litter. Should a human have passed through in the last 48 hours, at least one depression should show. They found none. Only deer prints and one faint bear track heading upslope. At 13:45, the trackers on the drainage team found a line of disturbed needles. 3 steps in a row. They tested depth and spacing. The spacing was irregular, the compression shallow, possibly an animal moving at angle. They followed it 12 yards until it blended into natural debris. Logged as unconfirmed. Near 14:30, a team checked a ledge overlooking a bowl east of the primary zone. They scanned the bowl with binoculars, watching for reflective material. Nothing caught light. The bowl floor held frost in shaded pockets. No sign of tracks or movement. Negative. As afternoon progressed, the extended perimeter continued yielding clean ground. No item. No print. No scent direction. The central anomaly remained the only place where any form of repeated pattern existed, and even that pattern held no confirmed evidence. At 15:50, a volunteer radioed in a faint scent near a stand of older firs. He described it as brief and indistinct. They searched the area around the stand. No disturbed soil. No sign of animals bedded down recently. No debris. The scent dissipated. Logged as unconfirmed odor. No direction. Shortly after 1600 hours, Pierce requested that all teams, on return, walk within 20 yards of the dog stall point. The crews complied. Each noted the same conditions observed during prior rechecks. Open forest. Even needle cover. No fresh disturbances. No broken branches. Nothing to suggest outward travel. By 1720, all teams reached the trailhead. Radios were set to charge, maps updated, equipment logged. The sky cleared enough to show the first line of cold evening light above the ridge. The whiteboard displayed a near-full perimeter of cleared sectors. The final note for Day 9 reads, "Outer sectors clear. No progression. No verified sign. Central point remains only persistent feature without explanation." Day 10 opened with a hard frost and a steady calm in the valley. The temperature held near freezing. Ground conditions were firm. Radios came online with clear signal checks. The crews gathered near the command canopy. Pierce reviewed the map again, tracing each cleared sector with the back of his pen. The same shape stared up from the board. A wide, empty perimeter and a tight, unresolved center. At 7:10, he assigned crews to an extended sweep beyond the northern ridge. This area lay outside the original search box. Travel routes were limited by terrain. If the missing man had somehow moved that far, there would need to be sign on one of the approach lines. None had been found in earlier passes, but the crews would walk them again. A second group was sent to recheck the valley floor from the creek upstream to the narrow bend. The ground there held patches of soft soil where recent prints should show. A third group would continue slow patterning around the anomaly center, overlapping paths taken by earlier teams. The northern sweep moved into mixed timber and scattered open rock. The team advanced slowly, checking each clearing before entering. At 7:50, a volunteer knelt beside a faint soil depression. They brushed it. No shape, no edge. Soil too granular to hold detail. Possibly animal. Logged unconfirmed. The valley floor crew moved along the creek line. Frost still clung to shaded banks. They found no marks in the frost layer. No prints crossing the water. No fabric caught on root tangles. The volunteers inspected a narrow cut where the bank undercut the grass. Clean. No disturbance. Logged negative. At 8:30, the helicopter returned for a short flight. It worked a grid above the northern ridge. The observer scanned for color contrast, reflective surfaces, and disturbances in frost where sunlight had not yet reached. The pilot reported negative findings. They passed once more above the primary anomaly and returned to base. By 9, the central recheck teams entered the area where both dogs had stalled earlier in the week. They moved in a slow, clockwise rotation. One volunteer stopped at a point where the needle cover looked slightly displaced. They brushed it. No underlying shape, no clear direction. Could have been from an animal. Logged unconfirmed. In the northern extension, the team reached a saddle that connected two shallow bowls. The saddle held mixed duff and thin soil. A tracker walked it carefully. No heel lines, no group depressions, no threads. Only windfall patterns consistent with seasonal weather. Negative finding. Near 9:45, a volunteer in the valley team radioed a brief scent near the creek bend. He described it as faint and without source. The others assessed. No carcass, no damp pockets disturbed. The scent faded within seconds, logged as unconfirmed odor without significance. At 10:15, Pierce requested that the central teams maintain a strict search line with reduced spacing. They moved through the anomaly zone again, marking any minor irregularities. The partial heel was still visible, but unchanged. The three shallow depressions first noted on day 3 appeared even more eroded by freeze cycles. The fiber sample flag held where it had been placed. No new item was found in the immediate area. Around 11, the northern crew reached a boundary where the terrain began sloping sharply. They broke into two pairs. One pair walked the upper line. The other followed a contour 30 yards below. Each found only animal sign. Fresh elk prints, small mammal trails, no indicators of human travel. After the midday break, Pierce directed two crews to examine a set of secondary drainages south of the original search area. These drainages had been scanned from distance, but not walked. Each drainage floor held loose soil and stone. The volunteers checked hollows under roots and brushed aside debris. No recent prints, no disturbed leaves. Negative. At 13:50, a volunteer on the central team crouched beside a small depression near the base of a fir. It was no more than 2 inches deep. They tested firmness. Soil compact. No shape. Could have been created by weather or an animal resting. Logged as low relevance. At 14:20, the extended sweep to the north radioed in a faint glint seen on a rock shelf. They approached cautiously. The glint came from mica in the stone. No metal present. No gear. Negative. The valley floor team completed another full pass upstream. They checked all alcoves, root tangles, and gravel bars. Nothing had shifted. No impressions had formed. No foreign objects. Negative. Near 15:20, the Central Zone teams slowed their pace even further. They walked lines spaced 6 feet apart. One volunteer carried a probe. They tested every soft patch. They lifted bark from fallen logs. They checked hollow stumps. Everything was recorded. Nothing indicated human passage. By 16:40, the air cooled again. Light dimmed in the timber. Pierce asked all teams to return through the anomaly center. They walked slowly, scanning the ground. No changes. No new scent indication. No prints. No debris. The zone remained as it had been for days. Quiet ground. Even cover. No direction. At 17:20, the searchers arrived at the trucks. Radios were placed on charge. Equipment logged in. The whiteboard updated with new cleared areas. Only one zone remained marked with question marks. The central cluster around the dog stalls. The final entry for Day 10 states, extended regions fully cleared. No subject. No additional sign. Central anomaly remains the only unresolved focal point without track progression. Day 11 began under a cold, still sky. Frost lay heavier than the previous days. In open areas, it formed thin plates that shattered under each step. Radios came online with clear channels. The crews gathered near the command post, their breath showing in the early light. Pierce reviewed the map again. The cleared perimeter now reached well beyond any practical travel distance for a subject on foot in this terrain. Only the center remained unresolved. At 7, he assigned 2 teams to begin slow spirals outward from the anomaly zone. expanding the radius by 10 yards each rotation. Another team was sent to walk the entirety of the main trail beyond the first bend, checking both sides for overlooked sign. A fourth team would recheck the heel-shaped depression, the 3 shallow impressions, and the flagged fiber. The spiral team started at the exact point of the first dog stall. They spaced 6 feet apart. Their pace was deliberate. They paused at each irregularity. A patch of compressed needles, a disturbed leaf, a shallow pocket in the soil. Each was documented. Each was ruled natural. No print, no tread, no direction. The main trail crew walked slow along the creek. Frost melted where sun reached, leaving damp sections ideal for tracking. Yet the surface was clean. No boot marks, no drag lines, no newly formed depressions. They stepped to the water edge. No sign of entry. No wet impressions. Negative findings logged at 7:50. At 8:21, volunteer in the spiral team paused. He thought he saw a small indentation beside a root cluster. They brushed it gently. Soil compact. No heel. No toe. Could have been formed by runoff or an animal shifting. Logged unconfirmed. Around 8:40, the helicopter made another pass. It hovered briefly above the anomaly point. The observer scanned the canopy. No movement. No reflective surfaces. The aircraft shifted to the ridge and then to the valley mouth. All sectors returned negative. At 9, the recheck team reached the partial heel. Frost had settled lightly on its edges overnight. When brushed away, the depression looked unchanged from earlier days. No new definition. No associated marks. It remained a single isolated impression without continuation. They checked the 3 shallow depressions nearby. They had degraded further. Freeze and thaw had rounded them. No spacing suggested stride. No alignment indicated direction. Logged again as unconfirmed. They moved to the fiber flag. The marker was intact. No new material near it. The soil around it showed no disturbance. The fiber itself remained the only item with any human association, and even that could not be tied to the missing subject. By 9:50, the main trail crew reached the valley bend. They stepped into the brush on the inside curve. They found a single deer bed. They found one old elk rub. They found no human sign. Negative. At 10:15, the spiral teams widened another 10 yards. They entered a section of mixed fir where roots wove across the ground. One volunteer halted at what looked like a shallow scuff near 2 crossing roots. They studied it. The soil beneath held no pattern. The scuff was irregular, possibly animal, logged as low relevance. Around 11, a team rechecked a narrow drainage west of the anomaly. They walked it from top to bottom. Soft soil along the edges held animal tracks. No human impressions. No torn vegetation. No fabric. Negative. During the midday break, Pierce assembled the sector leaders. He ran down every logged clue again. None showed progression. None aligned. The absence of outward track was becoming the defining feature of the file. He told the teams to continue with slow, meticulous work. No shortcuts. At 1300 hours, a 2-person crew moved to a minor ridge spur south of the anomaly. They followed the crest for 100 yards. They checked each side. A faint discoloration in the soil caught attention. The volunteers scraped lightly. Natural mineral stain. No impression. Negative. At 1350, the spiral teams crossed into a shallow bowl east of the center. The bowl floor held frost pockets that should have preserved footprints. They found only small animal tracks. No human. Negative. A deputy working with the western sweep paused at a low cedar. He thought he heard a faint metallic sound in the distance. The team stopped and listened. Nothing followed. No echo. No repetition. Logged as unconfirmed sound with no direction. Around 1510, the central teams completed their largest spiral radius of the day. No new clues. No anomalies not already documented. The ground remained consistent. Open forest. Even needle cover. No progression outward. At 1620, the wind shifted downslope. Temperature dropped. Frost began forming again on shaded soil. Pierce asked teams to return through the anomaly area. They checked each flagged point. No change. The ground looked the same as the hour before, as the day before, as the week before. By 1700 hours, everyone was back at the trucks. Radios were placed on charge. The map updated. The central cluster stayed marked with the same unresolved symbols. The final entry for day 11 reads, "Expanded spirals complete. No confirmed sign. No outward movement detected. Central anomaly unchanged." Day 12 began with a thin overcast and a colder wind moving down from the ridge. The ground held a patchwork of frost in shaded areas. In the open timber, the frost had already begun to break. Radios came online with clear channels. Pierce stood by the command board for a long moment before speaking. The perimeter had grown so large that practical limits were approaching. He told the crews they would begin selective target sweeps of terrain features that had not been examined up close. Small bowls, steep cuts, narrow shelves, places where a person might have sheltered or become trapped. At 7:10, the first target team moved to a rock formation north of the anomaly zone. The formation rose about 15 feet above the slope. The volunteers climbed it and scanned the gap beneath the largest boulder. Pine needles had drifted in. No disturbance, no prints, no cloth. Negative finding. A second team approached a narrow shelf in dense fir. They advanced single file. The shelf dropped steeply on one side. They swept the flat ground inch by inch. Soil compacted by frost. No impressions. No fallen gear. Only old cones and wind-fallen needles. Negative. At 7:50, a deputy and 2 volunteers returned to the dog stall point. They began a set of microgrids around the exact area the dogs had circled. Flags marked each 10-yard square. The volunteers examined each square with a probe and headlamps even in daylight, checking root pockets and depressions. No fibers. No prints. No foreign objects. Around 8:15, the helicopter passed over again. The observer checked the ridgeline for any sign of fresh movement. The wind allowed a slow hover. No color contrast. No thermal return. The aircraft shifted to the east drainage. Negative across the board. At 8:40, the drainage team entered a steep cut that had been viewed several times from above, but never walked. The cut narrowed in places to a width of 2 feet. Soil along the base was soft. If the missing man had slid or moved through it at any point, the cut should hold clear sign. The volunteers walked it top to bottom. Animal prints only. No human impressions. Negative. Shortly after 9, a team working near the valley mouth found a piece of weathered tape caught on a branch. It was brittle and sun-faded. The adhesive had failed long ago. They examined it. Too degraded to match any searcher equipment. Could have been from old boundary marking, logged as unrelated debris. At 9:30, the basin team reached a shallow bowl west of the anomaly. They swept the bowl in overlapping passes. Frost remained on the north edge. They checked it carefully. No breaks, no tracks. Only the faint prints of a small mammal crossing diagonally. Negative. By 10, a volunteer on the eastern shelf sweep paused beside a faint soil change. The surface looked slightly smoother in a small circle. They tested it. Soil compact. No heel. No toe. Possibly from water pooling and freezing. Logged unconfirmed natural. At 10:30, the central team began another slow walk through the anomaly area. They moved with reduced spacing. Each volunteer scanned the ground with a flashlight to catch low-angle shadows cast by irregularities. The partial heel remained as it had been. The shallow impressions held no new shape. The fiber flag remained the only material item. No new sign emerged. Around 11:15, a deputy on the recheck team walked the old logging spur to its end, then continued another 100 yards into timber, beyond where earlier crews had stopped. He crouched near a line of 3 shallow depressions in duff. They looked similar to the impressions found days earlier, but lacked alignment. They photographed them. logged unconfirmed. At midday, Pierce gathered team leads for a brief review. A week of effort had produced no progression outward from the center. He directed everyone to maintain measured pace and avoid speculation. The search would continue as long as daylight and resources allowed. At 12:50, a two-person crew inspected a deadfall cluster south of the anomaly. They checked each cavity under the logs. One hollow held a pocket of soft soil. No disturbance, no prints. They moved on. At 13:30, a volunteer on the western slope reported a faint odor near a pair of old stumps. They paused. No visible source, no disturbed ground. The odor dissipated within seconds. Logged unconfirmed odor without direction. Around 1400 hours, a team reached a knoll overlooking a narrow draw. They scanned the draw and then entered it. Soil soft, no sign of a slide, no tracks, no debris. They walked it end to end. Negative. At 1520, the Ridgecrest team checked the rock ledge used by hunters again. Dust appeared undisturbed. No prints, no casings, no signs of any recent occupation. The ledge remained as empty as on earlier visits. With daylight fading, Pierce called for all teams to return through the anomaly center. The volunteers followed the same paths as previous days. Nothing changed. The ground remained clean and quiet. No movement outward. No defining clue. By 1700 hours, they reached the trucks. Radios were placed on charge. The whiteboard updated. The same single unresolved area remained at the center of the map. The final entry for Day 12 reads, all targeted features negative. No indicators. No outward travel. Central zone remains unresolved. Day 13 began with a low ceiling of cloud and a colder air mass pushing through the upper basin. Frost held in the timber longer than usual. The ground alongside the creek stayed firm until mid-morning. Radios checked clear. The crews stood in a half circle near the command canopy, while Pierce outlined the plan. They would begin a set of extended spoke searches radiating from the anomaly center. Each spoke would follow a compass bearing for a fixed distance before curving back to overlap the next. The intent was to confirm, with final certainty, that no travel line had been missed. At 7:10, the first spoke team began on a bearing of 40 degrees. They moved in tight formation, spacing no more than 10 feet, checking each patch of duff and each pocket of soil. The slope rose gradually. Animal tracks crossed at angles. No human impressions. No fabric. No metallic reflectors from dropped gear. Negative for the first 800 yards. The second spoke team advanced on a bearing of 120 degrees. Their line crossed mixed fir and thin rock shelves. At 7:40, they located a shallow, irregular depression in pine needles. They crouched and brushed it. No defined shape. No directional alignment. Soil beneath showed no heel. Logged as unconfirmed natural. A third team followed a 200-degree line. They entered denser timber. Needles formed a deep mat. Any recent passage would have broken the top layer. They scanned for darker patches where compression might show. The mat was uniform. Only faint deer paths and a few older bear tracks. Negative. At 8:20, the helicopter made a low pass. It hovered at the upstream end of the valley and then drifted toward the ridge. The observer reported no visible anomalies, no discoloration in frost patches, no thermal signatures. The aircraft circled the anomaly center once and then departed. At 8:45, the spoke team on bearing 40 degrees paused near a small outcrop. A volunteer found a thin fissure in the soil against the stone. He probed it gently. The soil crumbled. No depth, no disturbance. Logged natural. By 9, the spoke team on bearing 200 degrees reached a shallow knoll. Frost still held in the shaded pocket on the north side. They checked for breaks in the frost. None. The surface lay clean. Only animal prints in a diagonal line. Negative. At 9:20, the team working on bearing 120 degrees reached the center of a small bowl. One volunteer halted. A faint change in soil tone caught his eye. They brushed it. No heel. No edge. Possibly a wet patch dried unevenly. Logged unconfirmed. Pierce ordered a mid-morning regroup. The spoke teams returned to the Anomaly Center for reassessment. None had found directional sign. None had identified a travel line moving outward. The whiteboard remained unchanged. At 10, Pierce assigned new spokes on fresh bearings. The first team moved out at bearing 70 degrees. They crossed a gentle rise covered in lichen-streaked stones. They inspected each patch of duff between stones. No depressions. No fibers. Negative. The second team took bearing 160 degrees. They moved along a slight contour. At 10:30, they found a line of disturbed needles. 3 faint depressions in a row. They tested spacing. Too close for a human stride. Too irregular for footwear. Likely animal. Logged unconfirmed. The third team moved at bearing 280 degrees. They passed through brush near a deadfall. One volunteer lifted a branch to check underneath. Only compacted needles from natural settling. No prints. Negative. Around 11, the creek corridor crew rechecked the lower bends for completeness. Water level unchanged. Banks held soft soil capable of registering footprints. They found none. No fabric. No debris. Negative again. At 11:25, the spoke team on bearing 70 degrees reached a narrow shelf above a drainage. They scanned the shelf edge. A volunteer noticed a slight depression near the lip. Soil firm. Frost intact. No shape underneath. Logged unconfirmed. Near noon, the bearing 160 team reached a minor ridge spur. They looked along its crest. The surface held a scattering of loose needles, but no clear sign of passage. Light wind moved through upper branches. Ground undisturbed. Negative. After the midday break, Pierce convened a quiet discussion with sector leads. 11 days of searching had produced no progression beyond the central cluster. He instructed the afternoon teams to extend their spokes farther, pushing the limits while maintaining meticulous ground checks on the return legs. At 1300 hours, a 2-person team began a long spoke at bearing 100 degrees. They crossed uneven ground, patches of stone, and pockets of soft duff. They found no prints, no broken branches inconsistent with weather, no disturbance. A second team advanced at bearing 220 degrees. At 1340, they noted a faint odor near a stand of fur. They paused. No visible source. No disturbed soil. The odor disappeared quickly. Logged as unconfirmed odor without direction. A third team moved at bearing 310 degrees. They skirted a low rock formation. One volunteer found a tiny patch of overturned duff. They brushed it. Underneath, the soil was dry and loose. No edge, no heel. Possibly an animal rooting. Logged unconfirmed. By 1500 hours, all extended spokes reported negative findings. Pierce ordered each team to re-enter the Anomaly Center from a different approach line, scanning closely for any subtle sign previously overlooked. The volunteers moved inward slowly. The partial heel remained unchanged. The shallow depression still lacked definition. The fiber flag held its place. No new marks had formed. The ground held the same clean pattern it had since the start. At 1630, a light wind rose from the ridge. Temperature fell. Frost began forming early on exposed patches. Pierce called teams back in steady order. By 1715, the last crew reached the trailhead. Radios were set to charge. Gear logged. The whiteboard updated. The central zone held its same unresolved markings. The final entry for Day 13 reads, "Spoke searches complete. No progression. No confirmed sign. Anomaly Center unchanged." Day 14 began with light snowfall drifting across the ridge. The flakes were fine and dry. They collected on branches and in small pockets across the timber. The dusting was thin enough that ground scans were still possible, but thick enough to complicate track interpretation. Radios checked clear. The crews gathered beneath the canopy, while Pierce spoke in a low, even tone. He explained that snowfall would obscure old sign, but reveal any new disturbance. They would focus on detecting breaks in the fresh layer. At 7:15, the first team moved toward the anomaly center. The snow lay less than half an inch deep, a clean surface. If any movement had occurred overnight, it would show plainly. The volunteers advanced slowly, examining each patch of ground. No prints, no drag lines, no boot edges, only the thin uniform layer of fresh snow. A second team worked the logging spur. They walked the full length from the trailhead to the spur end. Snow covered all previous impressions. They looked for any fresh tracks overlaying the dusting. None appeared. The surface was clean. Negative. At 7:50, the creek corridor team moved upstream. Snow on the banks was unbroken. Rocks in the water line held no disturbance. Brush remained undisturbed. They checked the undercut bank where raccoon prints had been seen days earlier. Snow covered the old marks. No new impressions. Negative. Around 8:20, the helicopter completed a low-altitude pass. The observer checked for any sign of recent passage across open patches. Snow provided a clear canvas. There were no tracks, no depressions, no color contrast from gear, only the natural pattern of trees and exposed stone. At 8:40, the central teams examined the partial heel depression under fresh snow. When they brushed it clear, the shape matched what had been documented earlier in the week. No expansion, no new definition, no adjacent prints. The shallow depressions nearby looked the same beneath the dusting. No change to the fiber flag or the soil around it. At 9:10, a volunteer on the western sweep noticed a break in the snow under a low fir. They crouched and cleared the flakes. Beneath was a small patch of disturbed duff. No defined shape, no clear edges. Possibly an animal step made before snowfall. Logged unconfirmed. By 9:40, the team in the east drainage reported a faint scent near a cluster of saplings. The wind carried it briefly. No disturbed snow beneath, no broken branches. The scent dissipated, logged as unconfirmed odor without direction. At 10, Pierce coordinated a shift in search pattern. Teams would now walk parallel sweeps on both sides of the anomaly center, watching for any break in the new snow layer as they moved outward. Spacing reduced to maintain visual overlap. The sweeps progressed slowly. The snowfall from early morning had stopped. The surface remained unbroken except for the team's own tracks. Volunteers maintained strict formation to avoid confusion. They found no new depressions, no signs of entry or exit from the central zone. At 11:20, a two-person team reached a small ridge spur east of the anomaly. Snow lay thicker in shaded areas. They examined each drift. No sign beneath, only wind-sculpted patterns. They pressed onward. Negative. Shortly before midday, a volunteer on the northern line paused near a downed log. A small indentation appeared under the snow. They cleared it. The depression was circular and shallow. Soil beneath lacked structure. Could have been an older animal bed. No associated prints. Logged unconfirmed. After the midday break, Pierce directed two teams to begin stepwise contour searches along the upper slope. Snow depth varied. In open timber, it was thin. On the sheltered side of trees, it gathered in shallow fans. They looked for any disturbance inconsistent with natural fall. They found none. Negative. At 13:40, a volunteer on the contour line halted and radioed a metallic sound from upslope. The team held position for a minute. No follow-up. No echo. They inspected the slope. Snow unbroken. No windfall movement. Logged as unconfirmed sound. By 14:10, the snowfall resumed lightly. Visibility remained good. Teams continued forward, aware that fresh flakes could soften edges of any print. They checked beneath each new accumulation. Nothing appeared. At 1500 hours, the central team performed another microgrid around the dog stall area. Snow lay evenly across the ground. No depressions showed beneath, except those already documented and known to be old. They brushed several spots and found nothing new. As daylight waned, the snowfall eased. The wind shifted north. Pierce called for orderly withdrawal. Teams followed their own tracks out to avoid confusing the surface. No unexpected impressions appeared on the return routes. By 1700 hours, all crews reached the trucks. Snow collected lightly on roofs and tailgates. Radios were placed on charge. The whiteboard updated once again. The same unresolved cluster held at the map center. The final entry for day 14 reads, "Light snow cover revealed no new movement. All sectors negative. Central anomaly unchanged beneath fresh surface." Day 15 began with a thin layer of overnight snow settled across the lower valley and a harder crust on the higher slopes. Sky overcast. Air still. The ground held enough new snow to register any fresh disturbance, but beneath it, the older surface remained readable where exposed. Radios checked clear at the command post. Crews gathered in a tight formation near the tailgate map, while Pierce spoke in a steady, quiet voice. He told them they would run a full set of containment sweeps around the anomaly zone, using the new snowpack as a clean slate. At 7:20, the first team moved along the western arc. They stepped carefully to avoid scattering the light snow as they passed. Every 10 yards, they paused and scanned the surface. No fresh prints, no breaks. Only bird tracks and the light marks of falling needles. Negative. The second team walked the eastern arc. They kept spacing close. Snow depth varied in small pockets. One volunteer crouched beside a faint indentation beneath a cedar branch. They cleared it. Soil beneath showed no heel edge, no pattern. Possibly an older animal track softened by the freeze cycle. Logged unconfirmed. Around 8, the helicopter completed a slow survey. The observer described the surface as uniform. No tracks leading toward or away from the center. No discoloration or movement. The aircraft banked once over the ridge and returned to base due to lowering cloud. At 8:30, the Creek's Corridor team reached a narrow bend. Snow covered the bank evenly. They checked the undercut sections. No disturbance. No imprint in the frost layer. Water ran shallow and clear. No cloth caught on debris. Negative. At 9, Pierce ordered the central teams to begin microgrids around the dog stall point. They walked squares roughly 10 feet across, marked by flagging. Each square was examined closely. Under the fresh snow, the needle cover looked unchanged. The partial heel impression remained faint beneath the surface. The 3 shallow depressions remained unaltered. No additional impressions connected them. The fiber sample flagged earlier lay partly covered, unchanged. At 9:30, a volunteer on the central grid noticed a slight rise in snow on a patch of duff. They brushed it away. A shallow pocket sat beneath. No shape, no print. Soil dry, possibly wind movement or natural settling. Logged unconfirmed. By 10, the wind shifted lightly from the ridge. Snow drifted in thin patterns across open patches. Teams adapted pace to avoid covering potential sign. They scanned every new drift. No marks appeared. At 10:20, the Western Arc team reached a group of downed logs. Snow collected on top of each trunk. They checked beneath the logs for cavities. No disturbance. No compacted areas. Only natural duff. Negative. Around 10:50, the Eastern Arc team found a small patch of disturbed snow near a root clump. They brushed it. Snow had slid off naturally due to melt from a rising patch of sunlight filtering between branches. Soil beneath was undisturbed, logged natural. At 11:15, the central teams re-examined the fiber location. Snow had gathered along one edge of the flag. The ground around it showed no sign of recent movement. They checked 6 feet outward in every direction. No new items. Shortly before noon, a volunteer on the northern sweep thought he heard a short, dull impact sound upslope. The team halted. They listened. No repeat, no echo. They searched the slope above. Snow unbroken. No falling limbs. Nothing disturbed. Logged unconfirmed sound. During the midday break, the crews stood under the canopy, reviewing maps. Pierce outlined the afternoon plan. They would conduct 3 long sweeps radiating outward from the center, each covering previously cleared ground, but now with the benefit of fresh snow as a detection surface. At 1300 hours, the first long sweep moved south. They crossed open timber where snow lay thin. They saw only the tracks of small animals. No human impressions. No drags. No breaks. Negative. The second sweep moved north across the lower benches. Frost lingered in shaded areas. Snow held clean. The volunteers walked slowly, looking for any change in the surface. None appeared. Negative. The third sweep moved east. They passed a low ridge spur. A volunteer paused beside a dotted pattern in the snow. After closer inspection, the marks were identified as squirrel tracks in a looping path. Logged as animal. At 1430, the teams returned to the anomaly center by different approach lines. They examined each entry path. Snow remained unbroken except for team tracks. The ground showed no movement by anything larger than small wildlife. Around 1500 hours, the helicopter attempted another pass, but returned early due to cloud ceiling lowering into the upper basin. No new observations were reported. At 1540, the central teams conducted a final loop around the dog stall point. Snow now lay in a thin crust. They brushed several depressions. None showed shape. None indicated direction. The same pattern as previous days held. By 1630, the wind rose slightly. Snow shifted across open areas. Teams were called back to avoid obscuring what remained of the surface detail. They followed their own tracks to avoid introducing irregular patterns. All crews reached the trucks by 1700 hours. Snow continued lightly. Radios were placed on charge. Maps updated. The central anomaly remained the only area on the whiteboard without resolution. The final entry for day 15 reads, "Fresh snow provided clear surface. No new tracks. No indicators of movement. Central zone unchanged." Day 16 began under a heavier sky. Snow had stopped during the night, leaving a thin but even crust across the ground. The air was still and cold. Sound carried farther than usual. Radios came online with clear channels. Pierce stood beneath the canopy, hands on the edge of the whiteboard. He spoke quietly. The search would continue with expanded outer loops and another full recheck of the anomaly center. The new snow surface would show any disturbance with clarity. At 7:10, the first team moved toward the upper benches west of the center. Snow depth there stayed uniform, just under an inch. They walked in a long line, spacing 10 feet where terrain allowed. Each volunteer watched for breaks in crust or exposed ground. They found only the small marks of birds and the looping trails of squirrels. No human impressions. The second team moved along the eastern slope. The trees stood close together, and snow lay in uneven pockets beneath. One volunteer paused near a shallow circular depression. They brushed away the snow. Beneath it, the soil showed no shape. The depression had likely formed from melt running off a low branch. Logged unconfirmed natural. At 7:50, the creek team followed the water line again. Snow collected along both banks. They searched for any clean footprints leading across the creek or down its edges. No such impressions presented. The bank held only fresh animal sign. Negative finding. Around 8:10, the helicopter attempted a short flight. Cloud ceiling limited altitude. The observer reported no new tracks in open patches and no reflective surfaces. The aircraft returned early due to low visibility near the ridge. At 8:30, the central team entered the anomaly zone. New snow had settled evenly overnight. They began brushing small squares around the dog stall point. Under the snow, the needle layer looked unchanged. The partial heel remained faint. No new edges. No connecting prints. The 3 shallow depressions had softened further under freeze and thaw. The fiber flag remained partly buried under the fresh layer, undisturbed. At 9, a volunteer noticed a low indentation near a downed branch. Under the snow, the soil was compact and featureless. No footprint. Logged unconfirmed. The team resumed the microgrid. At 9:20, The western extended team reached a narrow contour line above the ridge shoulder. Snow formed a clean surface. They stepped lightly. No breaks in the crust appeared. No directional disturbances. Negative. By 9:45, the eastern team approached a cluster of boulders. Snow collected in the gaps. They inspected each gap for traces caught in drifts. None appeared. Ground remained consistent with natural fall patterns. Negative. Shortly after 10, Pierce directed a set of containment loops around the larger perimeter. Teams advanced from 4 directions. Every 100 yards, they checked snow crust for signs of compression. No tracks, no drags, no scuffs, only animal lines and wind-blown flakes. At 10:50, a volunteer on the southern loop halted. He had seen a faint line cutting through snow. They examined it. A twig had fallen, dragging across the surface before landing. Under the snow, soil was undisturbed, logged natural. At 11:20, the central teams completed the first microgrid, then began a second, shifting their pattern slightly west. They brushed snow away in narrow strips. No new depressions, no fibers, no objects. The dog stall point remained the sole location where scent had once given direction, yet the ground still held no confirmation. At midday, the crews gathered under the canopy. Pierce reviewed the findings, or lack of them, in the same calm tone he had used every morning. He directed afternoon teams to run long outward sweeps in straight lines, then return along parallel courses to ensure overlap. At 1300 hours, the first long sweep headed northeast. Snow surface remained intact. Volunteers reported only scattered animal prints. No human sign. Negative. The second long sweep moved southwest. They crossed mixed timber and low brush. Snow depth varied, but showed no compression of human weight. They found a partial track near a stump but identified it as deer. Logged animal. The third long sweep moved north-northwest. At 13:50, a volunteer found a faint depression beneath snow. They brushed it. Soil revealed no heel, no shape. Could have been a small sink from melting. Logged unconfirmed natural. At 14:30, teams began their return legs. Each passed through the anomaly center from a different angle. Snow near the center remained smooth, except where teams had brushed it earlier. No new disturbances had formed. Around 1500, the cloud ceiling lowered. Light dimmed. The wind settled again. Under these conditions, any sound carried clearly. The western team reported a brief snap from the slope above. They stopped. Listened. No follow-up. They inspected the slope. Snow lay clean. No sign of recent fall. Logged unconfirmed sound. At 1540, the creek team completed a final sweep of the water corridor. Snow remained unbroken on the bank. No tracks. No scuffs. No movement outward. By 1620, the teams began orderly withdrawal. They walked back along their own tracks. Shadows deepened between the firs. Snow hardened as temperatures dropped. At 1700 hours, the last crew reached the trailhead. Radios were placed on charge. Gear accounted for. The whiteboard updated. No new sign. No progression. Only the same unresolved point remained at the map's center. The final entry for day 16 reads, "Full perimeter sweeps under snow cover. No movement. No indicators. Central zone unchanged. Day 17 opened with a thin fog settled along the lower benches and a colder band of air moving down from Sawyer's Ridge. Snow from the previous days remained patchy in open areas, but held firm in shaded pockets. Radios checked clear. Crews gathered under the canopy, while Pierce outlined the plan in a measured voice. They would conduct crosscut searches through terrain already cleared, moving perpendicular to previous sweep lines to identify any overlooked detail. At 7:15, the first crosscut team stepped off from the anomaly center on a bearing of 90 degrees. They advanced in a straight line, spacing reduced to maintain visual overlap in the fog. Snow lay shallow. The team brushed several patches where the crust had sagged. Beneath, the soil held no definition. Negative. A second team took a bearing of 180 degrees. They passed through a mix of fir and open ground. One volunteer knelt at a small depression in snow. When cleared, it showed a natural indentation from a fallen cone. Logged unconfirmed, natural. At 7:50, the northern crosscut team found a faint line in the snow between two stones. They examined it. A small twig had rolled down slope, leaving a track. Soil beneath was untouched. Negative. Around 8:10, the helicopter attempted a flight, but returned immediately due to fog density at ridge height. No observations were made. At 8:30, the central team revisited the partial heel and the 3 shallow depressions. Snow in the area had crusted overnight. They brushed it. The impressions remained unchanged. No shift in soil. No additional marks. The fiber flag showed no sign of disturbance. The ground told the same story it had for days. At 9, a volunteer on the southern crosscut swept snow off a small mound. Underneath lay a shallow hollow in duff. It lacked structure. No edge. Likely animal bedding. Logged unconfirmed. By 9:20, the eastern team reached a narrow saddle. Fog drifted across the ground. Snow remained intact. They scanned for breaks or scuffs. None presented. Negative. At 10, Pierce directed teams to extend their crosscuts another 200 yards. The western team moved through sparse timber, where the ground showed a mix of snow and exposed needles. A volunteer inspected a slight indentation. No heel, no toe. Soil undisturbed. Logged natural. At 10:30, a deputy on the north crosscut team paused, reporting a faint metallic sound from far upslope. The crew held position. They listened. Fog muffled distance. No repeat. They checked the slope edge. Snow remained unbroken. No fallen limbs or rock movement. Logged unconfirmed sound. Shortly before 11, the central team restarted a microgrid around the dog stall point, this time using narrower lines. They brushed each square to bare needle cover. No impressions. No fibers. No shift in soil. The area remained consistent with all previous assessments. At 11:20, a volunteer on the eastern line reported a faint odor in the fog. No source visible. No disturbed snow. The odor dissipated. Logged unconfirmed odor. During the midday break, Pierce reviewed the map with sector leads. The perimeter remained clear. The anomaly center unchanged. He assigned the afternoon crews to probe terrain features outside the main search box that had been noted but not closely examined. At 1300 hours, a 2-person team climbed toward a minor ridge spur north of the valley. Snow thinned on the approach. They inspected a set of shallow shelves. No prints. No debris. Negative. A second team entered a tighter drainage with boulders and narrow slots. They checked each recess. Snow collected unevenly. Beneath only bare soil. No sign a person had passed through. Negative. At 1340, the western probe team found a patch of overturned needles under light snow. They brushed it. The soil beneath showed no pattern. Wind likely lifted the needles. Logged unconfirmed natural. At 1410, the eastern probe team searched a series of cedar clusters. Snow caught in the branches fell as they passed. They checked the resulting bare spots. Soil smooth. No impressions. Negative. Near 1500 hours, fog lifted slightly. Light improved. Pierce instructed all teams to return through the anomaly center from divergent angles. They walked slowly, checking each approach line. Snow remained smooth. No tracks entering or leaving. The central features looked as they had for the past week. The same partial depression, the same shallow impressions, the same absence of outward movement. At 1545, a volunteer paused under a tall fir. He noted a faint change in the air, a short movement of scent. He could not place it. It faded instantly. They searched the immediate area. Snow undisturbed. No sign. Logged as unconfirmed odor. No direction. By 1630, temperatures dropped again. Snow hardened underfoot. Teams were called back. They followed their own tracks to avoid confusing any remaining surface detail. All crews reached the trailhead by 1700 hours. Equipment logged, radios charging, the whiteboard updated. The center remained the only unresolved zone. The final entry for Day 17 reads, "Crosscut searches complete. No track lines. No new evidence. Central anomaly persists without change." Day 18 began with clear air and a hard freeze across the valley. Snow had compacted overnight into a thin crust, bright under early light. Radios checked clear. The crews formed a semicircle near the command canopy, while Pierce reviewed the map one more time. He spoke with the same steadiness he had used since the first morning. They would conduct one final full sweep of all primary terrain, moving in long, overlapping arcs from the outer perimeter back toward the center. Every feature would be rechecked, every line retraced. Nothing would be left without confirmation. At 7:10, the first ARC team stepped off to the west. Snow cracked lightly under their boots. They scanned for any shift in the crust. Only animal trails broke the surface. No directional prints, no drag marks, no sudden depressions. Negative. A second team advanced north along the higher slope. Sunlight reached patchy sections of the ground, softening the surface. They checked each melt pocket for signs of pressure. None appeared. Soil beneath remained smooth. Negative. At 7:50, the Eastern ARC team found a small indentation beneath a cedar limb. Snow had sloughed off in a narrow fan. They brushed it. Soil underneath showed no shape. Logged, unconfirmed, natural. Around 8:10, the helicopter launched for what would be its last dedicated pass. Visibility was excellent. The observer scanned open timber, frost pockets, and the upper benches. No movement, no color contrast, no reflective surfaces, no track lines cutting through the snow crust. Negative on all sectors. At 8:30, the central team entered the anomaly zone again. They began brushing small plots around the dog stall point. Under the crust, the needle layer lay exactly as before. The partial heel still showed its soft outline. No sharper edge had appeared. No connecting impressions had formed. The three shallow depressions remained irregular and weathered. The fiber marker sat half-covered in snow. No new material lay nearby. At 9, a volunteer paused at a faint indentation beside a root mat. They brushed it open. Beneath was compact soil. No heel, no toe, no directional line. Logged unconfirmed. By 9:20, the Southern ARC team reached a group of downed logs at the valley edge. Snow collected among them. They lifted each section. Nothing beneath. No disturbed duff. No hidden pockets. Negative. At 9:45, the Northern ARC team approached a low bench with thin snow coverage. A slight change in surface color caught attention. They brushed it. Soil beneath was undisturbed, possibly a melt pattern. Logged natural. At 10, Pierce directed a final containment loop around the entire outer boundary. 4 teams moved simultaneously from different bearing lines. Each checked the crust for displacement. Each reported clean, unbroken snow, crossed only by the tracks of elk and smaller wildlife. No human impressions. Around 10:30, a deputy on the eastern loop signaled a halt. He believed he heard a faint clipped sound somewhere upslope. They listened. Air still. No follow-up. Snow on the slope showed no movement. Logged unconfirmed sound. Shortly after 11, the central teams completed another microgrid. Nothing changed. The area held the same quiet profile it had since the first day. No exit tracks, no sign of distress, no clothing, no shell casings, no prints. Just the same sparse irregularities that had never developed into evidence. At midday, the crews gathered beneath the canopy. Pierce reviewed the final phase plan. They would make a single, continuous sweep from the highest reachable ridge down to the valley floor, covering every elevation band. The sweep would end at the anomaly center. At 1300 hours, the ridge team began their descent. Snow thin, rocks cold with frost. They checked each ledge, each rock outcrop, each shallow dip. Negative along the entire ridge crown. The mid-slope team advanced 30 yards below them. They scanned for any sign a person had traveled parallel to the ridge. Snow unbroken. Only animal trails. Negative. The lower slope team checked a line of small drainages. Each held pockets of soft snow. A volunteer probed one pocket. Soil beneath smooth. No impression. Negative. At 1440, the creek corridor team made their last pass. Snow along the banks had crusted. No breaks. Water clear. Vegetation undisturbed. Negative. As afternoon light thinned, all teams turned toward the anomaly zone. They converged from 4 directions, walking slowly, studying every foot of ground. Snow near the center remained smooth, except where crews had passed earlier. The same sparse anomalies lay beneath. No new sign had formed. No outward print existed. No trace of the missing man appeared anywhere beyond that small, silent patch of forest. At 1630, Pierce called teams back to the trailhead. They walked in single file, following their own tracks down slope. The valley was quiet. No wind. No movement in the tree line. Snow settled lightly on the branches overhead. By 1700 hours, the last crew arrived at the trucks. Radios placed on charge. Gear logged. Maps closed. The whiteboard showed a complete perimeter of cleared ground, encircling a single unresolved point at its center. The final entry for Day 18 and the final summary note of the operation reads, "All terrain cleared. No confirmed evidence. No track. No direction. No subject located. Central anomaly remains unexplained."